Although most of us have never experienced anything like the COVID-19 pandemic we are currently in the midst of, it still pales in comparison to many pandemics of the past. The Black Death or bubonic plague caused about 50 million deaths across Africa, Asia, and Europe in the 14th century. It wiped out up to half of Europe's population. The notorious Henry VIII famously hid in his room and refused to let any visitors in. As many have said in recent months, they can understand him so much better now. The 1918 flu pandemic remains the worst pandemic in recent history. Approximately 500 million, or one-third of the world's population, became infected with it. It was responsible for 50 million deaths worldwide, or up to 3% of the world's population. There were 675,000 deaths in the United States alone. There were 3 different waves of illness during the pandemic, starting in March 1918 and subsiding by the summer of 1919. The pandemic peaked in the U.S. during the second wave in the fall of 1918. The highly fatal second wave was responsible for most of the U.S. deaths. As we discuss the historical and cultural context surrounding the 1918 pandemic, keep in mind a couple of the overarching themes we are focusing on this semester, like those of discontinuity and injustice. What would justice look like during a pandemic? How are the forms of injustice experienced then reminiscent of now? In what ways have we progressed and regressed? And what, if anything, can we learn from comparing the two? Laura Spinney, science journalist and author of Pale Rider, the Spanish flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World, says we are making some of the same mistakes today. For instance, many cities refused to listen to medical advice to shut down when it was clear things were starting to get bad, and they faced the consequences. There is also the issue of when is the right time to reopen, and many places reopening only to have a surge in the number of cases. In addition, many people back then also refused ordinances to wear masks, claiming it infringed upon their liberty. One person in San Francisco even got shot because of it. Perhaps most significantly, the pandemic in 1918 also brought to light disparities across class and racial divides. Blacks did not have access to the same health care as many whites, and under the policies of Jim Crow, they often were not allowed to be seen at the same hospitals. In many cases, they couldn't afford health care at all. Rural health care was also very rudimentary in many places, and there was no infrastructure in place to deal with anything of this proportion. But first, a bit more about the historical context. The Spanish influenza appeared on the heels of the United States' entry into World War I. After remaining neutral for 3 years since the war began in 1914, the United States made the decision to join as an Allied power. A message that became known as the Zimmermann telegram, intercepted by British spies, revealed Germany's aims of recruiting Mexico as an ally, promising to help them win back land that was lost in the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. On April 2, 1917, Woodrow Wilson went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. The world, he stated, must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. The war resolution passed the Senate 82-6 and the House 373-50. There was a lot of public opposition to U.S. entry into the war. In 1917, the government was unprepared for the enormous economic and financial strains of the war. The total cost of the war came to $33 billion current dollars, which was 42 times as large as all Treasury receipts in 1916. Government needed to bolster the economy, and fast. One key way of doing this was through war bonds. War bonds were initially known as defense bonds and were first issued as Liberty bonds in 1917 to finance the United States government participation in World War I. In spring of 1918, around the same time American forces actually began to mobilize, there were early reports of a flu-like outbreak. On March 4th, Private Albert Gitchell of the U.S. Army reports to the hospital at Fort Riley, Kansas, complaining of the cold-like symptoms of sore throat, fever, and headache. By noon, over 100 of his fellow soldiers had reported similar symptoms, marking what are believed to be the first cases in the pandemic. A pandemic is never convenient, but the 1918 flu outbreak came at an especially inopportune time in the American political scheme. Fostering patriotism was crucial to bolstering the economy and recruiting people to join the war efforts. As a result, reports of the flu as it began to spread were downplayed or ignored altogether by the media. Then, in May of 1918, the United States passed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to publicly do anything that would detract from war efforts, and informing the American people about the pandemic became an even hairier issue. Violating the Sedition Act could result in up to 20 years in prison, and one congressman did go to prison for violating it. The Sedition Act was an extension of the Espionage Act of 1917. The Espionage Act prohibited interference with military operations or recruitment, to prevent insubordination in the military, and to prevent the support of the United States enemies during wartime. The Sedition Act covered a broader range of offenses, notably speech and the expression of opinion that cast the government or the war effort in a negative light or interfered with the sale of government bonds. This act infringed on the rights of the First Amendment, which guaranteed the right to free speech. The United States was not alone in its censorship of the pandemic, and the web of lies proved the perfect ground for the pandemic to take root. According to historian Kenneth C. Davis, author of More Deadly Than War, The Hidden History of the Spanish Flu in the First World War, fear driven by propaganda, censorship, and lies were so much a powerful part of the spread of the Spanish flu. People were misled, often deliberately, by officials. Newspapers were censored. Even the name we use to identify the disease, reports Davis, is inaccurate. The reason it is the Spanish flu is because of censorship. During the war, Spain was a neutral country. It did not censor its news reports as rigorously as some of the warring countries did. So the first report of a massive epidemic comes out of Madrid in the spring of 1918, and that's the reason it was reported by Reuters in London that Madrid was under a mass epidemic. So that's the reason it's called the Spanish flu, but it did not originate there. Telling the truth might have made Spain a scapegoat, but hiding from reality did no favors for anyone. Spain's free press translated to more national awareness and health measures, and they only suffered an estimated 260,000 deaths compared to the United States' estimated 675,000 deaths. Nations that did not have developed healthcare systems suffered even more. India, for instance, had 20 million fatalities. A more accurate name for the Spanish flu, as virologist John Oxford points out on the podcast Backstory, would probably be the World War flu, or the politicians' flu. Politicians held much of the blame for the flu's millions of deaths. It wouldn't have been so deadly had it not been for the war and the large number of troops concentrated in Europe. States Oxford, I myself put it at the feet of politicians. If it had not been for that war, the pandemic would not have arisen. So here I want to pause for a moment to reflect on the nature of these two different crises, the war and the pandemic. One historian stated, unlike natural disasters or war, pandemics tend to divide people, not unite them due to isolation and fear. So I'll repeat that one more time. Unlike natural disasters or war, pandemics tend to divide people, not unite them, due to isolation and fear. The fear during a pandemic is primarily fear of contagion, of being in the physical proximity of others. During the pandemic, people are more divided in a literal sense, with social distancing being the most effective means of mitigation. During war and natural disasters, physical proximity is both necessary and encouraged. Patriotism is often rallied as well. Yet this observation is not as straightforward as it seems, that of pandemics dividing people and war and natural disasters uniting them. So I encourage you to reflect on this as we continue to discuss the topic. And a few questions to throw out there. What does it mean to be united? Is coming together as a community for a joint cause enough? If we think of unity in terms of justice, then all of these forms of conflict arguably make visible the structural inequities already in place. Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, did not even mention the pandemic in any of his speeches. Though he was known as a man of the progressive era who had a great respect for science, research, and what is happening in medicine, he continued to send troops overseas and focus on fostering patriotism for the war. By today's standards, his actions would seem inexcusable. The president at this time, however, was not seen as the warden of public health. Public health, in a federal sense, was pretty much non-existent at this time. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which today is headed by Dr. Anthony Fauci, was not founded until 1955. The first U.S. School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University had just started running in 1916, and its first graduating class in 1919 consisted of just one person, who was an MD or doctor. So the modern version of public health, which involves people trained in collecting data, did not yet exist. And even when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he tried to enact some public health measures from a federal perspective, and he was trying to address the issue of the lack of health care in rural areas. But he was met with opposition, and they were told that if a big health issue were to arise, that basically the states would have to deal with it, not the federal government. However, there was a Surgeon General at the time, Rupert Blue, but he was not an expert in infectious diseases, and his report was there is no cause for alarm if proper precautions are observed. And another top health official dismissed the Spanish flu as ordinary influenza by another name. Some of this might sound familiar, given the handling of today's pandemic on the federal level. And meanwhile, the disease persisted and grew increasingly alarming in the symptoms it presented. In mid-September 1918, Lieutenant Commander Paul Lewis was called in to inspect soldiers who were suffering from this strange new disease. And this is in the Army, where it's going on the most. It's proliferating amongst the soldiers in World War I. And there are rows of beds lined with fallen soldiers who are bleeding, yet they had not been in combat. So the doctors were stymied. Why are they bleeding? Historian John Barry writes, in The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest plague in history, most of the blood had come from nosebleeds. A few sailors had coughed the blood up. Others had bled from their ears. Some coughed so hard that autopsies would later show they had torn apart abdominal muscles and rib cartilage. And many of the men writhed in agony or delirium. Nearly all those able to communicate complained of headache, as if someone were hammering a wedge into their skulls just behind the eyes, and body aches so intense they felt like bones breaking. A few were vomiting. Finally, the skin of some of the sailors had turned unusual colors. Some showed just a tinge of blue around their lips or fingertips, but a few looked so dark one could not tell easily if they were Caucasian or Negro. They looked almost black, according to Lieutenant Lewis. So at the same time, things began to look worse on the home front, and the onus of how to handle the pandemic fell almost exclusively on individual communities and cities. Then, as now, quick and extensive measures paid off in flattening the curve. Philadelphia, one of the first cities to get hit, did not heed warnings. In September of 1918, a couple hundred soldiers had returned home to Philadelphia and an outbreak began there. So remember, there's still very little awareness about what's going on in the media, not only because of new censorship, but also because there are lower literacy rates at this time. And although newspapers are being increasingly consumed by the public, it's still not at the level that we have today with the internet and people, like most people in America, having some level of literacy to get the news spread to them and understand what's going on. So anyway, the outbreak began in Philadelphia in September of 1918, and it was mostly kept under wraps. But the doctors and officials were aware of what was going on. And public health doctors begged the city to take health measures early on, but they did not listen. And Philadelphia in 1918, just to give you a picture of it, it was teeming with people. So there were new jobs in steel and other industries, and it brought a ton of workers to the city. Sanitary conditions were not good. So multiple families would cram into one apartment. Sometimes one person would go to work and then another person would go sleep in the same bed without changing the sheets. And there was really very little way to avoid the spread of germs. So we learned during the earlier lecture on the Gilded Age and Realism about similar conditions in New York City, and we saw that New York City formed the first Department of Sanitation in 1881. Philadelphia, however, did not implement street cleaning until 1952. So as a result, in 1918, the streets were notoriously filthy, the gutters were filled with animal and human feces, and the conditions were perfect for the flu to spread. So a Liberty Parade was scheduled for September 28, 1918, and the doctors begged officials to cancel. The doctors tried to use the press to warn citizens that it was unsafe, yet city newspaper editors refused to run articles or print doctors' letters about their concerns. The Health Board of Philadelphia did not want people to panic. After the death of a few sailors and civilians, the board pronounced that the flu had reached its peak and should get better soon. Their stubbornness was fueled by war efforts. The federal government was desperate for the sale of those war bonds that we discussed earlier, the Liberty bonds, and every city had a quota of bonds it needed to sell to support the war. So, on September 28th, the Liberty Parade went on and thousands of people crammed into the downtown area. And you can probably guess what happened next. Within 76 hours, people began to get sick. It's hard to really envision the extent of it, though, partly because of how quickly this disease ran its course. So within 76 hours, the city's 31 hospitals had been filled to capacity. Some patients were squeezed in on balconies, floors, etc. In some cases, sick patients were lined on the floor in the hospital and rotated into beds when the people in the beds had passed away. Many people died within 24 hours of their first symptoms. And as with the soldiers we discussed earlier, there were reports of people turning dark blue or almost black from a lack of oxygen and bleeding from their nose, their mouth, their eyes, and their ears. So it was really, really horrific. And there was a crisis about what to do since there was a lack of space available. There was a lack of available people to help, and a lot of the doctors and nurses themselves were starting to get sick. So people with no medical training volunteered, and retired doctors and nurses came back to help serve. Soon after all this tragedy began, the city finally began to take action. 5 days after the Liberty Parade, they banned public meetings. A few hundred cases grew to hundreds of thousands getting sick. So many people died that they couldn't be buried quickly enough. And there are horrific stories about what happened. People often had to keep the dead at home, wrapped in blankets, because they had nowhere to take them. And if the people had gotten sick themselves, the family members, they might be so sick in bed that they couldn't gather the strength, and the people would just be next to them. There were cases of children who starved because parents were sick and no one wanted to go near their children to help for fear of getting sick themselves. This was especially a problem because those most likely to die were between 20 to 40 years old. So this was not the case in the first wave, but this now is the second wave, the one that is the most horrific, and young people get hit particularly hard during this wave. So by late October of 1918, 13,000 of orphaned children and a stalled city with a shortage on food was what Philadelphia faced. Other cities around the country, despite censorship in the news, caught wind of Philadelphia's dire state of affairs and responded in a variety of ways, ranging from irrational panic to effective safeguarding. Lower literacy rates and less understanding about germ theory and the spread of disease made for a comparatively uninformed public. In Phoenix, Arizona, rumors spread that dogs spread the disease, and policemen killed dogs on the street, and people killed their own pets in a desperate effort to prevent the spread of disease. In Colorado, towns set up barricades on the road, and men guarded them on shotgun. The only city during the second wave to avoid a terrible outbreak of the flu was San Francisco. San Francisco was one of the only cities that told the truth to its citizens. It ordered all public schools and gathering places closed. Leaders divided the city into separate regions so illnesses would be more self-contained within those regions. The city's government educated people on hygiene measures such as washing hands and wearing masks. The mask ordinance, signed by Mayor James Rolfe on October 22nd, made San Francisco the first American city to require face coverings, which had to be 4 layers thick. Even though San Francisco later on got hit harder during the third wave when they stopped these precautionary measures too soon, and they ended up having the 4th or 5th highest death toll of all U.S. cities, their initial response was a point of pride. Leaders pronounced that despite the tragedy, this will be one of the most glorious episodes in our history because of the way the city came together and functioned. The wide range of responses then and now was also evident in different facets of culture. There became an increased focus on hygiene that infiltrated the mass media, and Lysol, as now, became all the rage. Yet with less scientific knowledge than we have now, the products were sometimes more questionable. Shaving cream with Lysol, for instance, was a popular product during the pandemic. No thanks. At the same time, there were people who were in denial about the risk of germs spreading, and staunch anti-maskers arose. News reports noted resistance in many towns across the nation. The local health officer might order it. Whether it would be enforced was another issue. Usually arrests were made without violence, but in one instance, a San Francisco health officer shot 3 people, 2 of them innocent bystanders. Under the alarming headline, "Refuses to don influenza mask, shot by officer," a reporter for the Bellingham Herald described how the attempted arrest for a refusal to wear a face mask led to the shooting. On October 27, 1918, a special officer for the Board of Health named Henry D. Miller shot and severely wounded James Wisser in front of a downtown drugstore at Powell and Market Street, following Wisser's refusal to don an influenza mask. According to the police, Miller shot in the air when Wisser first refused his request. Wisser closed in on him, and in the succeeding affray, Miller shot him in the leg and right hand. Wisser was taken to the Central Emergency Hospital, where he was placed under arrest for failure to comply with Miller's order. Then, just as now, many felt it impinged upon their liberty to wear face masks. By more closely examining the various rationales, we can gain deeper insight into what liberty means to people. Alma Whitaker, for instance, writing in the Los Angeles Times on October 22, 1918, reviewed masks' impact on society and celebrity, saying famous people shunned them because it was so hard to go unrecognized. In this case, the notion of liberty is tied to that of having an individual identity, and the masks threaten to take that away. On November 9th, 1,000 people were arrested, the San Francisco Chronicle reported. City prisons swelled to standing room only. Police shifts and court sessions were added to help manage. "Where's your mask?" Judge Matthew Brady asked defenders at the Hall of Justice, where sessions dragged into night. Some gave fake names, said they wanted to light a cigar, or that they hated following the law. According to the New York Times article titled "The Mask Slackers of 1918. In Los Angeles, public feedback was solicited, and just as many felt that masks allowed them to enjoy more freedom because theaters, churches, and schools could stay open. Interestingly, many women suffragists fighting for the right to vote, which was not gained until 1920, supported the anti-masker cause. Surmises Allison K. Lange, an associate history professor at Wentworth Institute of Technology, One reason could have been that suffragists wanted to make sure their leaders were familiar political figures, Dr. Lynch said. Having a public profile, suffragists felt, was key to their success. So having an identity they believed was essential in order to gain their full liberty by winning the vote. Suffragists fighting for the right to vote made a gesture that rejected covering their mouths at a time when having their voices heard was of essential importance. At the annual convention of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association in October 19, they set chairs 4 feet apart, closed doors to the public, and limited attendance to 100 delegates, the Chicago Daily Tribune reported. In San Francisco, an anti-mask league was led by a woman, E.J. Harrington, a lawyer, social activist, and political opponent of the mayor. And other women filled its top ranks. So there were some men as well. 8 men also joined, and some of them represented unions and laborers. And there were 2 members of the board of supervisors who voted against the masks. So Brian Dolan, a medical historian at the University of California, San Francisco, states that the masks at this point turned into a political symbol. And this also sounds reminiscent of today. Continues Dolan, if you were to imagine who was anti-mask at the time, you imagine business people or skeptics of medicine. There isn't one perspective on why masks are a problem. It's medical, it's economic, it's personal freedom. When the second mandate came, this very specific group formed. The people like Harrington represented laborers. They were a voice that was on the opposite side of the spectrum of the business leaders. Different unions. The group was less concerned about masks and more anti-mayor. There were personal political agendas involved. In contrast to the anti-maskers' self-righteous claims to liberty were those whose socioeconomic conditions made them more susceptible to disease. Just as with today's pandemic, there were terrible outbreaks of the Spanish flu in prison settings. Blacks, interestingly enough, were not known to get the disease in higher numbers, although in an analysis of the 1900 census, W.E.B. Du Bois found that African American death rates were 2 to 3 times higher than for white people, for several diseases, including tuberculosis, pneumonia, and diarrheal disease. The possibility exists that their deaths were not accurately recorded, as they were typically treated, if they were able to get treatment at all, at separate but not equal hospitals. The crisis precipitated by the 1918 epidemic did not tear down any racial barriers in medical care. Another possibility, Alfred W. Crosby argues, that African Americans were more susceptible to Spanish influenza and that many contracted it during the milder spring epidemic, and thus were immune during the more severe fall epidemic. A third theory is that the segregation that was already practiced might have provided a de facto quarantine that provided some level of protection to the African American community. Regardless of their supposedly lower death rates during the pandemic, the stereotypes of biological racism and blacks being inferior persisted. The third wave of the influenza pandemic, as PBS speculates, was brought on by the post-war euphoria. World War I ended on November 11, 1918, and soldiers began to return from abroad in late 1918. Following the suit of the Spanish-American War 2 decades prior, World War I continued to establish the United States as a formidable international power. Woodrow Wilson utilized the 14 Points, which was a statement of principles for peace that was used for negotiations in order to end the war. Among the key principles of the 14 Points, as Eric Foner states, were self-determination for all peoples, freedom of the seas, free trade, open diplomacy, an end to secret treaties, the readjustment of colonial claims with colonized people given equal weight in deciding their future, and the creation of a general association of nations to preserve the peace. The focus on democracy and freedom inspired an increased focus on these values at home. Despite never addressing the pandemic, Woodrow Wilson still ranks as one of the best presidents in U.S. history. By today's standards, his complete disregard of hundreds of thousands dying of illness at home would be inexcusable. Jennifer Wingate, Associate Professor of American Studies at St. Francis College, points out that communities were anxious at this time to put the outbreaks of the Spanish flu behind them and to restore their faith in the nation. As a result, there were hundreds of statues erected to honor the image of the World War I veteran. Called doughboys, these statues not only showcased patriotism, but spoke to a desire to gloss over cultural anxieties. Writes Wingate, these images of very fit fighting doughboys shored up America's confidence during a vulnerable time. To show evidence of these strong, healthy, strapping men in a vigilant pose or going over the top worked to dispel fears about the economic and physical health of soldiers returning from war. By the Roaring '20s, the pandemic had become a thing of the past. It is not something that has endured as a hot topic in American culture, or at least not until there are new pandemics such as now, which compel us to go back and revisit our past. Some scholars have surmised that the scarcity of literature on the 1918 influenza pandemic suggests that we almost want to forget it existed. Though there are some exceptions, stories and archival materials that speak to this pandemic, such as Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, for the most part it has typically been subsumed within the larger history of World War I. This begs the question of why this topic lacks appeal in the cultural imagination, whereas depictions of the world wars prevail in books, movies, and more. Like the doughboy statue suggests, is it because we are seeking to project a national image that is strong and heroic, rather than one that is suffering and unwell? Pandemics upset our sense of order. Stemming from the Greek word pan, which means all-consuming, they cause us to drastically alter the way we live on a day-to-day basis and to constantly answer to the specter of fear and death looming over us. Most of all, they undermine and obstruct some of our most basic instincts, such as traveling and connecting with others. The divided landscape they necessitate is not amenable to the collective mourning that is needed to process what is taking place. Will our current COVID-19 pandemic also eventually become buried in the pages of history, or will we find a way to commemorate it and the unmourned dead in a way that does it justice? One thing stands certain, though it might not be what we want to hear. The 1918 pandemic proves that strict measures do pay off. Denying the reality only serves to cause damage. As historian John Barry said, the 1918 pandemic was almost like a control experiment supporting the hypothesis that telling the truth is the best way to go. A study in 2007 asked what pandemic planners could learn from the 1918 pandemic. Authors found that despite no effective vaccine, U.S. cities that were able to organize and execute a suite of classic public health interventions before the pandemic swept fully through the city appeared to do better than those that did not. School closure, public gathering bans, transportation restrictions, limited closure of businesses, and even face mask ordinances almost certainly mitigated the consequences of what historians have termed the most deadly contagious calamity in human history.